They sold her like livestock to pay a debt she never owed. Florence Whitmore stood at the altar in borrowed pearls, about to marry a man whose first wife died under suspicious circumstances. The church doors were already closing when hoofbeats shattered the silence. A man burst through, his voice echoing off stone walls with 3 words that changed everything. "She is mine." What happened next became the scandal of 1815 England, a story of desperation, rescue, and a love that defied every rule of society. The afternoon light fell weak and grey through the windows of Whitmore House, casting long shadows across the worn Persian rug that had once been her mother's pride. Florence Whitmore stood outside the door of what had been her father's study, her hand pressed against the dark oak, feeling the cold seep through her palm. Inside, she knew, sat her Uncle Charles, surrounded by ledgers and unpaid bills, waiting to deliver news that would change everything. She was 27 years old, too old for marriage by society's cruel standards, too poor to attract anyone respectable, and too proud to beg. But pride, she had learned in the 3 years since her father's death, was a luxury she could no longer afford. Florence pushed open the door. Charles Whitmore sat behind the massive desk, his thin frame nearly swallowed by her father's leather chair. He had always been a small man, but grief and resentment had carved him smaller still. His eyes, pale and watery, lifted to meet hers with something that might have been guilt if it had not been buried so deeply beneath irritation. "Come in, Florence, close the door." She did as told, moving across the room with the quiet grace her mother had taught her, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. The study smelled of old tobacco and mildew, the scent of decline that had settled over Whitmore House like a shroud. "Sit down," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "I prefer to stand, Uncle." His jaw tightened. "Very well. Then I will be brief. The debts are considerable, more than considerable. Your father, rest his soul, was a generous man. Too generous. The tenants paid nothing for years, the investments failed, the doctors demanded payment, and now the creditors are circling like vultures." Florence felt her throat constrict. "I am aware of the situation, Uncle Charles. I have offered to seek employment, a governess position or perhaps a lady's companion. I could send money home to help." He waved a hand dismissively, cutting her off mid-sentence. "A governess at your age, with no references and a tarnished family name. Do not be naive, girl. No respectable family would take you, and even if they did, what you could earn in a year would not cover a month's worth of what we owe. Then what do you propose?" Charles leaned back in the chair, his fingers forming a steeple beneath his chin. His expression shifted, and Florence saw something calculating enter his eyes, something that made her skin crawl. "I have found a solution. A gentleman of considerable means has made an offer. He is willing to settle all of the Whitmore debts in exchange for your hand in marriage." The room seemed to tilt. Florence gripped the back of the chair to steady herself. "Marriage? To whom?" "Mr. Victor Hale. He owns several gaming houses in London, very successful enterprises. He is a man of wealth and position." Gaming houses. Florence felt bile rise in her throat. Her father had despised gambling, had watched friends destroy themselves at cards and dice, and now her uncle proposed to sell her to a man who profited from such ruin. "I do not know him," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "We have never been introduced. That is of no consequence. He has seen you. At church, I believe. He finds you suitable." Suitable. The word hung in the air like a noose. "And what does Mr. Hale expect from this arrangement?" Florence asked, though she already knew the answer. A wife, a hostess for his home, the respectability that comes with marrying into an old family. Charles paused, then added, "He is 15 years your senior, but that is hardly unusual. He is in good health and good standing." Florence's hands trembled. "Good standing? Uncle Charles, I have heard things about Mr. Hale. There are rumors." "Rumors spread by servants and gossips," Charles interrupted sharply. "Idle talk means nothing. What matters is that this marriage will save the family from complete ruin. The house, the land, what little remains of our name, all of it depends on your cooperation, my cooperation." Florence felt something break inside her, some last fragile hope that her uncle might see her as more than a commodity to be traded. "I am to have no say in this matter. You are under my guardianship until you marry or reach the age of 30. The law gives me the right to arrange your future as I see fit." Charles's voice softened slightly, though it carried no real warmth. "I am trying to help you, Florence. Without this marriage, you will have nothing. No home, no income, no prospects. This is your only chance." She wanted to scream. She wanted to overturn the desk, scatter the papers, demand to know how he could call this help when it felt like a prison sentence. But years of training held her voice level, her posture erect. "When is this marriage to take place?" "Mr. Hale wishes to proceed quickly. We have set the date for 2 weeks from today. He will call on you tomorrow afternoon to make the formal arrangements." 2 weeks. 14 days until she became the property of a man she had never spoken to, whose eyes she had never met, whose touch she could not bear to imagine. Florence turned toward the door, her movements mechanical. "Where are you going?" Charles called after her. "To my room, Uncle. Unless I'm now denied even that small privacy." She did not wait for his response. She walked through the corridor, past the portraits of Whitmore ancestors who stared down with painted eyes that seemed to judge her weakness. Up the stairs, past the closed doors of rooms they could no longer afford to heat. Into her small chamber at the end of the hall, where the wallpaper peeled at the corners and the fire had not been lit in months. Only when the door closed behind her did Florence allow herself to sink onto the narrow bed. She did not cry. Tears were another luxury she could not afford. Instead, she sat in the gathering darkness, her hands folded in her lap, and tried to remember a time when she had believed her life might hold something more than survival. Through the window she could see the edge of the forest that bordered their land, the trees black against the fading sky. Beyond those woods lay Northbridge Park, the estate of the Duke of Ravensshire. She had not thought of that place in years, had tried not to remember the summer day when she was 17 and had almost drowned in the lake that divided the properties. She had been foolish then, wading in despite not knowing how to swim, desperate to escape the suffocating house and her father's illness. The water had pulled her under, cold and merciless. And then strong hands had grasped her, pulled her to the shore, held her while she coughed and gasped for air. "You are safe now." She had never seen his face clearly, only the broad shoulders, the gentle voice, the way he disappeared into the shadows before she could thank him. But she had never forgotten those words. "You are safe now." Florence pressed her hand against the cold glass of the window. She was not safe now, and she had no one left to save her. Florence woke before dawn, her body stiff from lying motionless through the night. She had not slept. How could she when every time she closed her eyes, she saw Victor Hale's name written in her uncle's precise hand, a signature that would bind her to a stranger for the rest of her life? She rose and moved to the small writing desk beneath the window, her fingers trembling as she pulled out a sheet of paper. The ink was old, the nib slightly bent, but it would serve. There was one person who might help. One friend who had escaped the prison of provincial life and made something of herself in London. Caroline Miller, once Caroline Ashford, before her marriage to a wealthy textile merchant. They had been inseparable as girls, sharing secrets and dreams beneath the oak trees that bordered both their families' properties. Caroline had promised on the day she left for London that Florence could always turn to her if she needed anything. Florence dipped the nib in ink and began to write. "Dearest Caroline, I pray this letter finds you well and that you will forgive my forwardness in writing after so long a silence. I find myself in circumstances most difficult and have nowhere else to turn. My uncle has arranged a marriage for me with a gentleman I do not know, one Mr. Victor Hale of London. The wedding is set for a fortnight hence, to settle debts left by my father's illness. I write to ask if you might know of any position I could secure in London, any family seeking a governess or companion. I am willing to work in any capacity that might allow me to support myself honorably and avoid this union. I would not ask if I were not desperate, dear friend. Any assistance you might offer would be a kindness beyond measure. Your devoted friend, Florence Whitmore." She sealed the letter with wax, her hands steadier now that she had taken action, however small. The Morning Post would carry it to London within 2 days. Caroline would respond. She had to. The week that followed felt like waiting for a verdict. Florence endured Victor Hale's first visit with frozen politeness, noting everything about him that confirmed her worst fears. He was handsome in a cold way, his dark hair perfectly groomed, his clothes expensive but flashy. His eyes lingered too long on her figure, assessing her as one might assess a horse at market. "You are quiet, Miss Whitmore," he said over tea in the drawing room, while her uncle watched with obvious satisfaction. "I prefer quiet women. There is too much chatter in society these days." "I find silence restful, sir," Florence replied, keeping her gaze fixed on her teacup. "Good, very good." He reached across and took her hand without asking permission, his grip firm to the point of pain. "We shall deal well together, I think. You will find me a generous husband, so long as you remember your place." Her uncle smiled. "My niece understands the value of gratitude, Mr. Hale." Florence said nothing. She endured the pressure of Hale's hand until he released her, endured his cold smile, endured the way he spoke about her as though she were not present. When he finally left, she retreated to her room and scrubbed her hands until the skin turned red. The reply from Caroline arrived 6 days after Florence had sent her letter. She recognized the handwriting immediately and tore the envelope open with shaking fingers. The note inside was brief, terribly brief. "Dear Florence, I received your letter and wish I could offer the assistance you request. Unfortunately, my husband believes it unwise for me to involve myself in matters of guardianship and family arrangements. He feels it would be improper for us to interfere. I am sorry. You deserved more than this." With regret, Caroline Miller Florence read it 3 times, searching for some hidden message, some sign that Caroline had written under duress. The phrase "you deserved more than this" suggested sympathy, but the rest was cold, formal, final. Whether Caroline had chosen this response or been forced to it hardly mattered. The result was the same. She was alone. That night, rain began to fall, heavy and relentless, drumming against the windows like fingers seeking entrance. Florence stood in her nightdress, pressing her forehead against the cold glass, watching water stream down in rivulets that blurred the world beyond. Her mind drifted, seeking escape in memory. She thought of the summer when she was 17, before her father's illness had consumed everything, before the debts had piled up, before hope had become a luxury. That summer, she had still believed life held possibilities. She remembered the heat, oppressive and thick, that had driven her to the lake, despite knowing she should not go alone. The water had looked so inviting, so cool and clear. She had waded in, just to her knees at first, then deeper, the mud soft beneath her feet. She had not known about the drop-off. One moment the water was at her waist, the next it was over her head, filling her mouth and nose, pulling her down with a force that felt almost malicious. She had thrashed, panic-obliterating thought, her lungs burning as she sank. Then hands, strong and sure, had seized her beneath the arms. She was pulled upward, breaking the surface with a gasp that felt like rebirth. The hands dragged her to shore, laid her on the grass, turned her on her side as she coughed water from her lungs. "You are safe now." The voice had been young but steady, cultured but warm. She had looked up through streaming eyes and wet hair, trying to see his face. But the sun was behind him, turning him into a silhouette, and by the time she could focus properly, he was already moving away, disappearing into the trees that bordered the lake. She had wanted to call after him, to thank him, to ask his name. But her voice would not work, and he was gone. Later, she learned that the lake divided Whitmore land from Northbridge Park, the estate belonging to the Duke of Ravenshire. The old Duke had died that spring, leaving the title to his son, a young man Florence had never met. She had convinced herself that her rescuer had been a groundskeeper, or perhaps a visiting gentleman, surely not the Duke himself. Dukes did not roam the woods alone, did not rescue drowning girls and disappear without expecting gratitude or reward. "You are safe now." She had carried those words with her for 10 years, a talisman against fear. But they were a lie, she realized now. She had never been safe. Not then, and certainly not now. Florence pressed her palm flat against the window, watching her breath fog the glass. In 2 weeks, she would marry Victor Hale. She would leave this house and enter another prison, one with finer furnishings and crueler bars. Unless something changed, unless someone intervened. But who would intervene for a woman with no fortune, no beauty by society's standards, and no value beyond the debts she could settle. The rain continued to fall, and Florence remained at the window, waiting for a dawn that felt impossibly far away. In London, in a townhouse in Mayfair, Caroline Miller sat at her own writing desk, her hands trembling as she composed a different letter, one her husband would never see. One addressed to a man she had met only twice, at dinners where titles and power mixed freely. She wrote carefully, precisely, leaving no signature. She described a woman being sold to settle debts, a woman named Florence Whitmore. She mentioned Victor Hale and the rumors that followed him like shadows. She mentioned Northbridge Park and a lake and a summer 10 years past. Then she sealed it, paid a street boy to deliver it, and prayed she had not just made everything worse. The letter would reach Howard Lancaster, Duke of Ravenshire, by morning. Howard Lancaster, Duke of Ravenshire, stood at the window of his London study, watching the morning light spread across Mayfair like spilled gold. He had been awake for hours, as was his habit, dealing with correspondence and estate matters that required his attention before Parliament convened. At 33, he had held the title for over a decade, long enough to understand both its privileges and its burdens. Power, he had learned, was only as valuable as one's willingness to use it justly. His father had taught him that, in the last coherent conversation they had shared before fever took him. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. His secretary, Mr. Pemberton, entered carrying a silver tray with the morning's post. "Your Grace, most of these are routine." However, this arrived by special messenger. Pemberton placed a sealed letter on the desk, unmarked except for Howard's name in careful script. No return address, no seal he recognized. "Thank you, Pemberton, that will be all." When the door closed, Howard picked up the letter, his instincts already alert. Anonymous correspondence was rarely benign. He broke the seal and unfolded the paper. The words struck him like a physical blow. "Your Grace, I write to inform you of an injustice being perpetrated against a lady of good family. Miss Florence Whitmore of Whitmore House is being forced into marriage with Mr. Victor Hale of London to settle debts incurred by her late father. The marriage is arranged without her consent by her guardian and uncle, Mr. Charles Whitmore. You may not recall Miss Whitmore, but 10 years ago, on the grounds near the lake that borders your estate and hers, you pulled a young woman from drowning. That woman was Florence Whitmore. Mr. Victor Hale is known among servants and those who work in his establishments as a dangerous man. His first wife died under circumstances described as accidental, but there are those who witnessed bruises and heard screams before her death. Miss Whitmore is being delivered into the hands of a man who may very well destroy her. If you value the life you once saved, you will investigate this matter with urgency. The wedding is set for a fortnight hence. A concerned party." Howard read the letter twice more, his jaw tightening with each pass. Florence Whitmore. The name unlocked a flood of memories he had carefully stored away. The lake, the summer heat, the sound of thrashing in the water as he rode past on his way back from inspecting the northern fields. He had not hesitated, had dismounted, and plunged in without thought for his clothes or dignity, only for the desperate need to reach the girl before she sank. He remembered her face when he laid her on the grass, pale and gasping, water streaming from her dark hair. He remembered the terror in her eyes slowly giving way to relief. He remembered wanting to stay, to make sure she recovered fully, but knowing that his presence would only complicate matters. A newly titled duke, unmarried, alone with an unchaperoned young woman. The scandal would have destroyed her reputation. So he had spoken those few words, "You are safe now," and disappeared into the trees before she could see him clearly or ask questions he could not answer without compromising her. Over the years that followed, he had seen her occasionally at church services, always seated with her ailing father, always dressed simply, always with a quiet dignity that set her apart from the chattering debutantes who filled the pews. He had wanted to approach her, to ask if she remembered that day, to introduce himself properly. But her father's decline was public knowledge, and Howard had no wish to add to her burdens by pursuing an acquaintance that might raise expectations he was not prepared to fulfill. And then she had vanished from society entirely. He assumed the father had died, that she had gone into mourning or perhaps left the area. He had not inquired. It seemed inappropriate. Now he learned she had been there all along, trapped under the guardianship of an uncle who saw her as currency. Howard rose abruptly, crossing to the bookshelf where he kept records of local families and business interests. He pulled down a leather-bound volume and flipped through until he found what he sought. Victor Hale, owner of 3 gaming houses in London, 1 in Bath. Rumoured connections to money-lending operations of dubious legality. No aristocratic lineage, but wealth enough to purchase respectability. Age, 42. Widowed. The entry was brief, clinical, unrevealing of character. Howard needed more. He rang for Pemberton. When his secretary appeared, Howard handed him a note he had just written. "Send this to Mr. Blackwood immediately. I want a full investigation into Victor Hale. Business dealings, personal history, the circumstances of his first wife's death. Everything. Spare no expense and expect results within 3 days." Blackwood was a former Bow Street runner who now worked privately for clients who valued discretion and thoroughness. If there was dirt on Victor Hale, Blackwood would find it. "Your Grace, may I ask the nature of the urgency? A woman's life may depend on what we discover. That is all you need to know." Pemberton nodded and left swiftly. Howard returned to the window, the anonymous letter still in his hand. Florence Whitmore. He tried to reconcile the terrified girl he had pulled from the lake with the woman she must be now. 27, the letter suggested, if his calculation was correct. Past the age most women married, especially without a dowry or family support. She would be vulnerable, desperate perhaps. Easy prey for a man like Victor Hale. The thought filled him with cold rage. He had saved her once. He had pulled her from water that would have claimed her life, had spoken words of safety and comfort, and then he had walked away because propriety demanded it. If he walked away now, knowing what awaited her, then those words would be rendered meaningless. "You are safe now." It had been a promise, whether he recognized it as such at the time or not, and Howard Lancaster did not break his promises. 3 days later, Blackwood's report arrived in a sealed envelope marked urgent. Howard dismissed his morning appointments and read it in the privacy of his study. The contents were worse than he had imagined. Victor Hale's first wife, Margaret, had died 5 years ago from a fall down the stairs of their townhouse. The inquest had ruled it accidental, but Blackwood had tracked down 3 former servants who told a different story. They spoke of arguments that ended with crashes and weeping, of Mrs. Hale appearing at breakfast with bruises on her arms and neck, always explained away as clumsiness, of the master's temper, especially when he had been drinking or losing at his own tables. One maid, now working for a family in Cheapside, had been present the day Margaret Hale died. She claimed in a statement she had been too frightened to give at the inquest that she heard shouting before the fall, heard Mr. Hale's voice raised in fury, heard the crash, and then silence. Blackwood's report also detailed Hale's business practices. Loans extended at usurious rates, enforcement methods that skirted the edge of legality, connections to men of questionable character. He was wealthy, yes, but his wealth was built on the desperation of others. And now he wanted Florence Whitmore. Howard set the report down carefully, his hands steady despite the fury coursing through him. He had seen enough, more than enough. He pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began to write. Not to Florence directly, that would be improper and might endanger her further. Instead, he wrote to the creditors he knew were pressing Charles Whitmore. He made discreet inquiries about purchasing the debts outright. If he controlled the debts, he controlled the leverage Hale held over the Whitmore family. It would take time, require careful negotiation, but it was possible. But time was the one thing he did not have. The wedding was set for 11 days hence. Howard stood, his decision crystallizing into certainty. If legal methods moved too slowly, he would employ less conventional means. He had power, wealth, and a willingness to use both in service of justice. Florence Whitmore would not marry Victor Hale. Howard would see to that personally, even if it meant creating the scandal of the decade. He looked out at the London skyline, his reflection ghostly in the glass, and made a silent vow. The girl he had once pulled from drowning would not be sacrificed to a monster, not while he drew breath. "You are safe now," he had promised her once. He intended to make those words true again. the gentleman's club on St. James Street reeked of privilege and vice in equal measure. Cigar smoke hung thick in the air, mingling with the scent of expensive brandy and the musk of men who believed the world existed to serve their pleasures. Howard entered with the confidence of a man who belonged, though he rarely frequented such establishments. They reminded him too much of the excesses his father had warned against. Victor Hale held court at a corner table, cards spread before him, a glass of whiskey at his elbow. He was winning, judging by the pile of markers in front of him and the sour expressions of the other players. When Howard approached, Hale looked up with the practiced smile of a man accustomed to greeting potential marks. "Your Grace." The smile widened, revealing teeth too white, too perfect. "What an unexpected honor. Will you join us for a hand? I wish to speak with you privately, Mr. Hale. It concerns a business matter." Hale's eyes sharpened with interest. He gathered his winnings, made his excuses to the other players, and gestured toward a private room off the main floor. Once inside, with the door closed against prying ears, Howard got straight to the point. "I understand you are to marry Miss Florence Whitmore." Hale poured himself another drink, his movements leisurely. "I am. In 8 days' time, to be precise. A charming girl, if a bit too somber for my usual taste, but she comes with certain advantages." He swirled the whiskey in his glass. "I assume you are here to offer congratulations. I am here to make you an offer." Howard kept his voice level, though every instinct urged him to put his fist through the other man's smug face. "I will purchase the Whitmore debts from you directly. Name your price." Hale's eyebrows rose. How intriguing. And why would a duke concern himself with the financial troubles of a declining country family? "That is my affair." Hale moved to the window, looking down at the street below. He was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost its veneer of civility. "You know, Your Grace, there was a woman once, Lady Elizabeth Thornton, beautiful creature, daughter of an earl. I courted her with every intention of making an offer, but she laughed in my face, said she would rather die than marry a man who made his fortune from the weaknesses of others. That has nothing to do with Miss Whitmore." Hale turned, and the look in his eyes made Howard's skin crawl. "It has everything to do with her. You see, Miss Whitmore has that same quality, that quiet superiority, that belief that she is somehow above me, despite her poverty and desperation." He took a slow sip of his drink. "I am going to enjoy teaching her otherwise." Howard took a step forward, his hands clenching into fists. "You speak of a woman as though she were property to be broken. She will be my property, my wife, mine to shape as I see fit." Hale set down his glass with deliberate care. "And before you consider doing something rash, Your Grace, remember that I hold legal contracts with Charles Whitmore. The debts, the marriage arrangement, all properly witnessed and sealed. If you interfere, you will only delay the inevitable and possibly make things worse for the lady in question. I can outbid any sum you have agreed upon, but you cannot outpace time." Hale smiled, and it was the smile of a serpent. 8 days, Your Grace. Even if you began purchasing debts tomorrow, you could not acquire them all before the wedding. And I only need one debt to remain valid for the marriage contract to hold. Charles Whitmore is bound by honor and law. His niece will be at that altar." Howard stood perfectly still, his mind racing through options, calculating possibilities. Hale was right about the time constraint. Even with all his resources, untangling the web of creditors and contracts in 8 days would be nearly impossible. Which meant legal methods alone would not suffice, I see. Howard nodded slowly, as if accepting defeat. "Then I wish you joy of your marriage, Mr. Hale. How gracious of you." Hale's satisfaction was palpable. "Now, if you will excuse me, I have a game to return to." Howard left the club, his jaw tight with barely contained rage. Behind him, Victor Hale returned to his cards, secure in his victory. He did not notice the determination in the Duke's stride or the cold calculation in his eyes. At Whitmore House, Florence endured another visit from her future husband. This time he brought gifts, a necklace of garnets that looked like drops of blood, and a book on wifely duties that made her stomach turn when she flipped through its pages. "You will wear the necklace at the wedding," Hale said, fastening it around her neck without asking permission. His fingers lingered on her skin, and she fought the urge to recoil. It belonged to my first wife. She treasured it. Florence's hand went to the stones at her throat. They felt cold, heavy. How did she die, Mr. Hale, if you do not mind my asking? His expression did not change, but something flickered in his eyes. Something dark. An accident. She fell down the stairs. Very tragic. His hand moved to her shoulder, gripping it with casual possessiveness. You must be more careful than she was, my dear. I would hate to lose another wife to carelessness. The threat was barely veiled. Florence felt her blood run cold. Charles Whitmore, hovering near the door like an anxious shopkeeper, cleared his throat. Mr. Hale has arranged for the modiste to deliver your wedding gown tomorrow, Florence. The finest silk, imported from France. How generous. Florence forced the words past her lips. Hale leaned closer, his breath hot against her ear. I expect gratitude, Miss Whitmore. A wife should be grateful to her husband for his protection and provision. You will learn this, in time. He straightened, releasing her shoulder. I will see you at the altar in 8 days. I trust you will not disappoint me. After he left, Florence remained in the drawing room, her hand still touching the garnet necklace. She wanted to tear it from her throat, to throw it into the fire. But that would only anger her uncle and accomplish nothing. 8 days. 8 days until she belonged to a man who spoke of control and obedience, who looked at her not with affection, but with the cold satisfaction of one who had won a particularly satisfying wager. That night, Charles entered her room without knocking, carrying papers. The marriage settlement. You will sign here and here. He pointed with ink-stained fingers. What am I signing? A standard contract. Upon marriage, all remaining Whitmore properties transfer to Mr. Hale's management. A reasonable arrangement, given his investment in our family's future. You mean his payment for me? Charles's face flushed. You are being dramatic. This is how marriages of convenience work, Florence. Many women would be grateful for such an opportunity. She looked at the papers, at the spaces where her signature would seal her fate. Did you know his first wife died under suspicious circumstances? Her uncle's hand trembled slightly as he set down the pen. Rumors. Nothing more. The inquest found no fault. But you have heard them. I have heard many things. None of them are my concern, nor should they be yours. He pushed the papers closer. Sign, Florence. Do not make this more difficult than it needs to be. And if I refuse, then I will petition the court to declare you mentally unfit to manage your own affairs. You will be removed to an asylum for your own protection, and I will sign on your behalf. His voice held no warmth, no familial affection. Do not test me, girl. I have been patient, but my patience has limits. Florence stared at him, seeing clearly for the first time how much he resented her father for his generosity, resented the debts that had fallen on his shoulders, resented her very existence as a reminder of his own failures. She picked up the pen and signed. When Charles left, Florence walked to her window and looked out at the darkened grounds. 8 days. She had 8 days to accept her fate or find a miracle. Neither seemed likely, but somewhere in the darkness beyond the trees that separated her land from Northbridge Park, Howard Lancaster was already preparing to provide the miracle she did not know to hope for. The wedding gown arrived on a grey morning, carried into Whitmore House by 3 assistants from London's most expensive modiste. Florence stood in her room while they unwrapped layer after layer of tissue paper, revealing a creation of ivory silk and seed pearls that must have cost more than her father had earned in a year. It is exquisite, Miss Whitmore, one of the assistants said, her voice hushed with reverence. Mr. Hale spared no expense. No, Florence thought bitterly, he spared nothing except my consent. They dressed her like a doll, cinching the corset tight, smoothing the silk over her hips, adjusting the drape of the train. The woman in the mirror was a stranger, elegant, refined, lifeless. The gown was beautiful. It was also a cage woven from thread and pearls. Your hair will be dressed with orange blossoms on the day, the head assistant said, pinning a sample sprig near Florence's temple. And Mr. Hale has sent these. She opened a velvet box to reveal a tiara of diamonds that caught the light and threw rainbows across the walls. They look like ice, Florence murmured. They are quite valuable, miss. A family heirloom, I am told. From his first wife, no doubt. Florence wondered if Margaret Hale had worn them on her wedding day, if she had looked in a mirror and seen the same hollow eyes staring back. After the fitting, Charles summoned her to the study. His desk was covered with receipts and bills marked paid in red ink. He gestured to them with something approaching triumph. "You see? Mr. Hale has been more than generous. The creditors are satisfied. The remaining servants have been paid their back wages. Even the grocer has stopped his complaints." He looked at her as if expecting gratitude. "This marriage saves us all, Florence. It saves you, Uncle. Not me." His expression hardened. "Ungrateful girl. Do you know how many women would consider themselves fortunate to marry a man of Mr. Hale's wealth? You act as though I am sending you to the gallows." "Perhaps you are." Charles stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Enough of this melodrama. The wedding is in 5 days. You will stand at that altar, speak your vows, and behave as a proper bride should. Is that understood?" Florence said nothing, and her silence was answer enough. That evening, alone in her room, she pulled out her mother's old writing desk and found the secret compartment her father had shown her years ago. Inside was a miniature portrait of her parents on their wedding day, young and hopeful, their faces filled with the kind of love Florence had always imagined for her own future. She traced her mother's painted face with one finger. "I am sorry, Mama. I could not find another way." She wrote a letter to her father, though he had been dead for 3 years. She told him about the debts, about Uncle Charles, about Victor Hale and the wedding that would end everything she had hoped to be. She asked his forgiveness for not being stronger, for not fighting harder, for surrendering. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and placed it in the secret compartment along with the portrait. Then she closed the desk and locked it, knowing that once she married, even these small treasures would no longer belong to her. Everything would belong to Victor Hale. The next morning, Florence walked the grounds of Whitmore House, memorizing the gardens her mother had planted, the stone bench where she had read as a child, the path that led through the woods toward the lake. 5 days. 5 days of freedom remaining. She did not notice the rider watching from the tree line. Howard had arrived in the village 2 days earlier, taking rooms at a small inn under an assumed name. He had brought his younger brother Edward, both as companion and as witness to whatever might unfold. Edward, at 28, possessed a steadier temperament than Howard and a talent for calming his brother's more impulsive instincts. "This is madness," Edward said as they rode through the woods that bordered Whitmore land. "You plan to disrupt a wedding, possibly abduct the bride and create a scandal that will follow you for years. Have you truly thought this through?" "I have thought of nothing else." Howard guided his horse along the familiar paths of his youth. He had spent hours riding these woods after his father's death, seeking solace in the silence of ancient trees. "I will not allow that woman to be delivered to a man who will destroy her. And if she does not wish to be rescued, if she has made her peace with the marriage?" Howard reined his horse to a stop at the edge of a clearing. Through the trees, they could see Whitmore House, smaller and shabbier than he remembered. "Then I will accept her decision and find another way to protect her from a distance, but I must offer her the choice. That much I owe her." They watched as a figure emerged from the house and walked slowly through the garden. Even at a distance, Howard recognized her. Florence Whitmore, no longer the terrified girl he had pulled from the lake, but a woman bearing the weight of impossible choices. She sat on a stone bench and bowed her head. Her shoulders shook, and Howard realized she was crying. The sight struck him like a blade between the ribs. Edward laid a hand on his brother's arm. "The wedding is in 5 days, at St. Mary's Church in Ashford Village. If you mean to intervene, it must be then. There will be no other opportunity." "I know." Howard's hands tightened on the reins. His horse shifted beneath him, sensing his tension. "I will not fail her again." They returned to the inn as dusk fell. Howard spent the evening reviewing his plan, such as it was. He would attend the wedding, present his evidence of the debts he had managed to purchase, and argue that the marriage contract was void. If that failed, he would appeal directly to Florence, offering her protection and an escape. It was reckless, it was dangerous, it might very well ruin both their reputations. But the alternative was unthinkable. Before you go any further into this story, I need to ask you something. If you are feeling Florence's desperation, if her story is touching your heart, Would you take a moment to subscribe to this channel? And here is something I truly want to know. What would you do in Florence's position? Would you fight, flee, or accept your fate? Leave your answer in the comments. Your voice matters, and I read every single one. Now let us return to Florence because her wedding day is almost here, and everything is about to change. On the 4th day before the wedding, Victor Hale made his final visit to Whitmore House. He inspected Florence as one might inspect merchandise before purchase, commenting on her posture, her dress, her demeanor. When he took her hand, his grip was bruising. "I have heard disturbing rumors, Miss Whitmore. Whispers that you are less than enthusiastic about our union." Florence met his eyes, refusing to look away, despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "I will honor the arrangement, sir. You will do more than honor it. You will embrace it, cherish it." He pulled her closer, his other hand gripping her waist with possessive force. "I do not tolerate disobedience or ingratitude. My first wife learned that lesson, though it took her some time. I trust you will be quicker to understand." The threat was crystal clear. Florence felt her breath catch, but she kept her voice steady. "I understand you perfectly, Mr. Hale. Good. Very good." He released her abruptly and turned to Charles. "Everything is prepared for the ceremony?" "Everything, Mr. Hale. The church is reserved, the vicar is expecting us, and I have arranged for a small wedding breakfast afterward." "Excellent." Hale collected his hat and gloves. "I will see you at the altar, my dear. Do try to look happier. Brides should radiate joy, not resignation." After he left, Florence stood in the empty drawing room, her hand pressed against her bruised waist. 4 days. 4 days until she became Mrs. Victor Hale, until her life ceased to be her own. She walked to the window and looked out at the darkening sky. Somewhere beyond those trees, in a world she could no longer reach, people lived lives of their own choosing. They loved freely, married willingly, built futures on hope rather than desperation. Florence pressed her forehead against the cold glass and whispered to the gathering night, "If there is anyone who can save me, please, let them come before it is too late." In the woods beyond, Howard Lancaster heard the unspoken prayer, as clearly as if she had shouted it. He turned his horse toward the village, his mind made up. 4 days until the wedding. 4 days to prepare for the most important rescue of his life. The morning of the wedding dawned cold and colorless, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain. Florence woke before the servants came to prepare her, her body stiff from a sleepless night spent staring at shadows on the ceiling. "This is the day I die," she thought. Not literally, perhaps, but the woman she was would cease to exist the moment she spoke those vows. The servants arrived with mechanical efficiency, transforming her into the bride Victor Hale expected. They bathed her, dressed her hair with orange blossoms, laced her into the ivory gown that felt like a burial shroud. The diamond tiara pressed against her temples like a crown of thorns. One of the older maids, Mrs. Hewitt, who had served the Whitmore family since before Florence was born, met her eyes in the mirror. Her expression was filled with sorrow and helplessness. "You look beautiful, miss," she whispered. "I look dead," Florence replied. Charles appeared at her door, dressed in his finest coat, a document case under his arm. He surveyed her with satisfaction. "Perfect. Mr. Hale will be well pleased." He set the case on the dressing table and removed a thick sheaf of papers. "You will sign this after the ceremony. The final transfer of property deeds." Florence stared at the papers. After today, she would own nothing. Be nothing. The carriage ride to St. Mary's Church in Ashford Village took 20 minutes that felt like 20 seconds. Florence watched the familiar countryside roll past, memorizing trees and fields she would likely never see again. Victor Hale's London townhouse would be her prison. The church was small, built of grey stone that had weathered centuries of English rain. Only a dozen guests waited inside, mostly business associates of Hale's, men with hard eyes and harder smiles. No friends, no family, except Charles. The vicar, Reverend Morrison, stood at the altar with an expression that suggested he found this wedding as distasteful as Florence did, but he was bound by duty and the generous donation Hale had made to the parish. Victor Hale waited at the altar in a coat of midnight blue, his dark hair gleaming with pomade, his smile sharp as broken glass. He watched Florence walk down the aisle, with the satisfaction of a man who had won a particularly difficult wager. Charles delivered her to Hale's side like cargo, then retreated to the front pew. Hale took her arm, his grip immediately possessive, his fingers digging into her flesh through the silk. "You look acceptable," he murmured, his breath hot against her ear. "Remember what I told you about gratitude." Reverend Morrison cleared his throat and opened his prayer book. His voice echoed in the stone chamber, formal and distant. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of God and in the presence of these witnesses to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. Marriage is an honorable estate, instituted by God, and signifying the mystical union between Christ and his church." The words washed over Florence like waves over a drowning woman. She felt herself sinking, her vision narrowing to a single point of light that grew dimmer with each moment. If any person present knows of any lawful impediment to this marriage, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. Florence closed her eyes. This was her last moment of freedom. After this, she would speak vows that would bind her until death, and death, she suspected, would not be long in coming. The silence stretched. Then, from outside, the sound of hoofbeats. Fast, urgent, growing louder. The church doors burst open with a crash that made everyone turn. A figure stood silhouetted against the grey morning light, tall and broad-shouldered, his riding coat billowing around him. Dust covered his boots, and his hair was wind-tossed, but his bearing was unmistakably that of a man born to command. Howard Lancaster, Duke of Ravenshire, stepped into the church. His voice rang out, clear and absolute. "She is mine. She does not belong to him." The congregation erupted in gasps and murmurs. Victor Hale's face flushed crimson with rage. Charles Whitmore half rose from his pew, sputtering protests. But Florence felt something crack open inside her chest. She knew that voice. She had heard it 10 years ago, had carried it with her like a talisman against fear. "You are safe now." Howard strode down the aisle with the confidence of a man who had never questioned his right to occupy any space. He stopped 3 paces from the altar and drew papers from inside his coat. "Reverend Morrison, this marriage cannot proceed. I hold legal documents proving that I have purchased the majority of debts owed by the Whitmore estate directly from the original creditors. Mr. Hale no longer has financial claim over this family, and therefore the marriage contract is void." Hale stepped forward, his hand dropping from Florence's arm. "This is madness. Those are my debts, purchased legally from Charles Whitmore. You have no right to interfere." Howard's expression was ice. "I have every right. The contracts you signed with Mr. Whitmore were predicated on debts owed to third parties. I now hold those debts. Your leverage no longer exists." He turned to the vicar. "This wedding is based on coercion and financial manipulation. I ask you, as a man of God, can you in good conscience proceed?" Reverend Morrison looked between Howard and Hale, his discomfort evident. "Your Grace, this is most irregular." Hale moved closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You dare come here and attempt to steal my bride? This is kidnapping. I will have you arrested. You cannot steal what was never yours by right." Howard's gaze shifted past Hale to Florence, and his expression softened. His eyes held hers, and in them she saw recognition, determination, and something that made her heart stutter in her chest. "Miss Whitmore," his voice gentled, "you do not have to do this. You do not have to marry this man. Come with me, please." She recognized him then, truly recognized him. Not just the voice, but the shape of his shoulders, the way he held himself, the absolute certainty in his eyes that had once promised her safety when she was drowning. "The Duke who saved me." Hale grabbed her wrist, yanking her back. "She is mine by contract, by arrangement. You have no claim." Howard moved with startling speed. His hand shot out, grasping Hale's wrist and twisting until the other man was forced to release Florence or have his arm broken. "Let her go." Hale stumbled back, his face contorted with rage. "This is theft, assault. I will see you ruined for this." Howard ignored him. He extended his hand to Florence, his eyes never leaving hers. "You have a choice. You always had a choice. They took it from you, but I am giving it back. Come with me, and I promise you will be safe. Stay, and I will walk away. But the choice is yours, Florence." She looked at his outstretched hand. Strong, steady, promising protection without demanding surrender. She thought of Victor Hale's bruising grip, his cold smile, his threats. She thought of the life that waited for her in London, the slow death of spirit that Margaret Hale had suffered. And she thought of the lake, the water closing over her head, and the hands that had pulled her to safety. Florence placed her hand in Howard's. His fingers closed around hers, warm and firm, and she felt something like hope flare to life in her chest. No, Hale lunged forward, but Howard was already moving, pulling Florence toward the aisle. Charles tried to block their path, but Edward Lancaster, who had been standing unnoticed near the door, stepped forward and caught the older man's arm. "I would not, sir," Edward said quietly. They reached the door. Outside, Howard's black stallion waited, pawing the ground impatiently. Howard turned to Florence, his hands going to her waist. "Hold on to me." He lifted her onto the saddle, her wedding gown bunching around her legs, the train dragging in the dirt. He swung up behind her, one arm circling her waist to pull her back against his chest. She felt the solid warmth of him, the steady beat of his heart against her spine. Behind them, Hale burst through the church doors, shouting threats and curses. Charles followed, his face purple with apoplexy. Howard's arm tightened around Florence. His breath was warm against her ear as he spoke words that echoed from a decade before. "You are safe now." Then he spurred the horse forward. They thundered down the road, leaving Ashford Village behind in a spray of mud and scandal. Florence's veil tore free and streamed behind them like a white banner. The diamond tiara slipped from her hair and tumbled into the dirt, forgotten. She should have been terrified. She should have been thinking of the consequences, the scandal, the ruin that would follow them both. But all she could feel, pressed against the chest of the man who had saved her twice now, was a wild, fierce joy that tasted like freedom. They rode toward Ravenshire Lodge, toward an uncertain future, toward a choice Florence had never dared to hope she would have. And for the first time in years, she did not feel like she was drowning. Ravenshire Lodge emerged from the woods like something from a dream, a stone hunting cottage, surrounded by ancient oaks and overgrown gardens. It was small by aristocratic standards, but solid and well-maintained, smoke already rising from the chimney where Edward had gone ahead to prepare for their arrival. Howard brought the horse to a stop in front of the entrance and dismounted before reaching up to help Florence down. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet touched the ground. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the escape was draining away, leaving her shaking and breathless. She looked down at herself. The ivory wedding gown was splattered with mud, the hem torn, the delicate silk stained beyond repair. Orange blossoms hung limply in her disheveled hair. She looked like the survivor of a shipwreck, which, in a way, she was. "Come inside," Howard said gently, not touching her but staying close enough that she could feel his presence. "You are safe here." That word again, safe. She wanted desperately to believe it. Edward met them at the door, his expression carefully neutral, despite the extraordinary circumstances. "Miss Whitmore." "Your Grace, I have prepared the sitting room and taken the liberty of asking Mrs. Brennan from the village to attend Miss Whitmore. She should arrive within the hour." "Thank you, Edward." Howard guided Florence inside, with a hand barely touching her back, as though afraid too much contact might shatter her. The lodge was warm and simply furnished, a relief after the oppressive grandeur she had been anticipating in Victor Hale's London townhouse. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across worn but comfortable furniture. Someone had laid out tea and bread, simple fare that suddenly seemed like a feast. "Sit, please," Howard said, gesturing to a chair near the fire. "You must be exhausted." Florence sat, her hands folded in her lap to stop their trembling. Now that the immediate danger had passed, reality was crashing down on her. "What have I done? What have we done?" Howard removed his riding coat and draped it around her shoulders. The wool was warm from his body heat and smelled of leather and rain and something indefinably masculine that made her pulse quicken. He pulled a chair close to hers and sat, maintaining enough distance to be respectful, but near enough that she could see the concern in his eyes. "You have done nothing wrong," he said firmly. "I am the one who disrupted a wedding and effectively abducted a bride. The scandal will fall primarily on me. But I went willingly. I chose to take your hand, Florence looked up at him, seeing his face clearly for the first time. He was handsome in a way that was more striking than pretty, with a strong jaw, intelligent eyes, and an expression that suggested both strength and kindness. "You are the Duke of Ravenshire. You saved me from the lake 10 years ago. You remember, I have never forgotten your voice, those words you spoke. I carried them with me." She felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back fiercely. "Why did you come today? Why risk your reputation for someone you do not even know?" Howard was quiet for a moment, his gaze steady on hers. "I received an anonymous letter detailing your situation. When I read your name, I remembered that day at the lake. I remembered pulling you from the water, seeing your face. Over the years, I saw you occasionally at church, always with your father. I wanted to approach you, to introduce myself properly, but the timing never seemed right." He leaned forward, his forearms resting on his knees. "Then I learned what your uncle had done, what Victor Hale truly is. I had my investigator look into him. And what did you find? The truth about his first wife's death. Evidence of violence, coercion, dangerous business practices." Howard's expression darkened. "I could not let you marry that man, Florence. I could not save you once and then stand by while you were destroyed." The use of her given name sent warmth through her chest. "But what happens now? My uncle will not let this stand. Mr. Hale will demand justice. We have created a scandal that will follow us both, which is why we need to discuss your options." Howard rose and moved to the fireplace, his back to her for a moment as he gathered his thoughts. When he turned, his expression was serious, but not unkind. "I have 3 proposals for you to consider, 3 paths forward. The choice will be entirely yours." Florence straightened in her chair, pulling his coat more tightly around her shoulders. "I am listening. First, I can arrange passage for you to France or Italy. You would have a new identity, a comfortable income from investments I will establish in your name, and the freedom to live as you choose, far from England and its gossips. You would be safe, independent, and able to start fresh." The idea was tempting, but also terrifying. To leave everything she had ever known, to live in exile forever. "Second," Howard continued, "I can settle you in a house somewhere along the coast, Brighton or Bath perhaps. You would have my protection and financial support, though you would inevitably face questions and whispers. Society would eventually create some story to explain your situation, and you could build a quiet life there. But I would always be the woman who ran from her wedding," Florence said quietly. "The object of speculation and pity." "Likely, yes." Howard moved back to his chair and sat, his eyes never leaving hers. "Which brings me to the third option. You could marry me." The words hung in the air between them like something fragile and precious. Florence stared at him. "Marry you? But we barely know each other. I am aware of the irregularity of the proposal." Howard's voice was steady, measured, as though he had rehearsed this. "But consider the practicalities. As my wife, you would have complete protection under law. The title of Duchess of Ravenshire would shield you from scandal and give you a position in society that no one could challenge. You would have financial independence, a home, and the freedom to pursue your own interests. And what would you gain from such an arrangement?" Howard was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was softer, more vulnerable. "The knowledge that I prevented your destruction, the satisfaction of seeing justice done, and perhaps in time the companionship of someone I believe to be remarkable." He met her eyes directly. "I would not expect a traditional marriage, Florence. Separate rooms, your own household management, complete autonomy. I would ask only that you allow me to provide protection and that we present a united front to society. Nothing more would be required of you. Nothing more." The words should have been reassuring, but Florence found herself feeling oddly disappointed. "You would marry me out of duty, out of conviction that it is the right thing to do." Howard's expression was unreadable, "But I will not lie to you. I have admired you from a distance for years. When I learned of your situation, my response was not purely altruistic. I wanted to help you, yes, but I also wanted to keep you safe because the thought of you in danger was unbearable to me." The honesty of his confession took her breath away. Florence looked into the fire, watching flames dance and twist. 3 options, 3 futures: exile, isolation, or marriage to a man she barely knew but who had already saved her twice. The door opened, and Edward entered with Mrs. Brennan, a stout woman with kind eyes who immediately began fussing over Florence's torn gown and disheveled hair. But Florence barely noticed. Her mind was racing, turning over possibilities and consequences. Edward approached his brother. "A word, Your Grace." They stepped into the corridor, and Florence heard Edward's low voice. "This is madness, Howard. You are proposing marriage to a woman you have spoken to for less than an hour. Think of the implications. I have thought of nothing else for days." Howard's voice carried clearly. "I will not abandon her now." When they returned, Florence had made her decision. She stood, letting Howard's coat slip from her shoulders. She felt stronger now, steadier. The terror had burned away, leaving something clearer in its place. "I choose the third option," she said, her voice firm. "I will marry you, Your Grace. Not because I have no other choice, but because I believe you are a man of honor. Because you have given me something no one else has, the power to choose my own path." She stepped closer to him, close enough to see the surprise and relief flash across his face. "I do not expect love from this marriage, but I do expect honesty, respect, and the freedom you have promised. Can you give me that?" Howard bowed his head in a gesture that was almost reverent. "You have my word, Miss Whitmore." "On my honor as a gentleman and a duke." "Then I accept." Florence extended her hand. When they touched, she felt a spark of something she could not quite name. Not merely gratitude, not simply relief, but something warmer and more complex. Edward cleared his throat. "Then we should make arrangements immediately. The vicar in the next village, Father Benedict, is discreet and sympathetic. I believe he would perform the ceremony without asking too many questions." Howard nodded, his hand still holding Florence's. "Tomorrow morning, then, if that gives you enough time?" Florence thought of the wedding she had just fled, the ivory gown and diamond tiara, and cold vows spoken under duress. This would be different. This would be her choice. Tomorrow is perfect. That night she slept in a small room at the lodge, Mrs. Brennan keeping watch nearby. But sleep was elusive. Florence lay in the darkness, listening to the sound of footsteps in the room next door where Howard paced, unable to rest. She thought about the lake, about drowning and being saved, about cages made of silk and freedom bought with scandal, about a man who had risked everything to give her a choice. And she thought about tomorrow when she would stand before a vicar once more and speak vows that would bind her for life. But this time, the words would be her own. The wedding at the small village church was nothing like the nightmare Florence had fled. She wore a simple dress of pale blue muslin borrowed from Mrs. Brennan's daughter, and there were wildflowers instead of orange blossoms in her hair. Edward stood as witness, and Father Benedict spoke the words with genuine warmth, rather than dutiful coldness. When Howard slipped the ring onto her finger, his touch was gentle, his eyes searching hers for any sign of regret. She gave him a small smile, and something in his expression softened. The kiss was brief, almost chaste, but Florence felt it in her entire body. His lips were warm and firm, the contact lasting only a heartbeat. But when they pulled apart, their eyes held longer, and she saw something in his gaze that made her breath catch. They returned to London 3 days later, Howard having sent word ahead to prepare the household. The townhouse in Mayfair was magnificent, 4 stories of pale stone with windows that caught the morning light. Servants lined up to meet their new duchess, their expressions curious but respectful. "This is your home now," Howard said as he helped her from the carriage. "You may change anything you wish, dismiss or hire staff as you see fit. The household accounts are yours to manage." "Mine?" Florence stared at him. "Truly?" "Yours. I meant what I said about autonomy." He offered his arm. "Shall I show you your rooms?" Her apartments were connected to his by a single door, discreet but present. The bedroom was decorated in soft greens and golds, with a canopied bed, a writing desk by the window, and a dressing room that could have held 10 times the wardrobe she owned. It was beautiful. It was also clearly intended to be her private domain. That evening, they dined together in a smaller parlor rather than the formal dining room. The conversation was tentative at first, both of them testing the boundaries of their new relationship. But Howard proved to be thoughtful and well-read, asking her opinions on politics and literature with genuine interest rather than polite condescension. "You seem surprised that I value your thoughts," he observed, pouring wine into her glass. "Most men do not." Florence traced the rim of her glass with one finger. "My uncle certainly did not." "Then most men are fools." Howard's expression was serious. "You have lived through experiences that would have broken many people, yet you remain strong, intelligent, and kind. Your perspective is valuable precisely because it is hard-won." The compliment warmed her more than the wine. Over the following weeks they fell into a pattern. Mornings were spent separately, Howard managing estate business and parliamentary duties while Florence explored her new role. She visited charitable organizations, particularly those supporting women in difficult circumstances. Her own experience gave her insight that wealthy patronesses often lacked, and she quickly gained a reputation for practical compassion rather than distant generosity. In the evenings they came together, sometimes for dinners, sometimes for the theater or social calls. Howard was always attentive, offering his arm, noticing when she grew tired, listening to her observations about the people they met. In public, they appeared to be a devoted couple. In private, the tension grew. It was in the small moments, the brush of fingers when he handed her a book, the way his gaze lingered on her when he thought she was not looking, the heat that flared between them when they danced at a ball, his hand on her waist, their bodies moving in perfect synchronization. Florence found herself thinking about him at odd times, the sound of his laugh when Edward told an amusing story, the way he pushed his hair back when he was concentrating on correspondence, the strength in his shoulders when he helped her from a carriage. She began to notice the door that connected their rooms. At night, lying in her luxurious bed, she would hear him moving about, the soft sounds of him preparing for sleep. Sometimes she heard him pace, restless as she was. The breaking point came after a dinner party they hosted for several members of Parliament and their wives. Florence had been nervous, aware that society was watching closely to see how the scandalous Duchess would comport herself. But the evening had been a success, the guests charmed by her intelligence and grace. After everyone left, Howard found her in the library, standing at the window and looking out at the moonlit garden. "You were extraordinary tonight," he said, approaching slowly. "Every person in that room admired you." "I was terrified," Florence admitted, not turning to face him. "I kept thinking they could see through me, that they knew I was a fraud playing at being a duchess." "You are not a fraud." Howard's voice was closer now, just behind her. "You are more a duchess than women born to the role. You have dignity, compassion, and strength. Do not diminish yourself." She turned then and found him nearer than she expected, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his eyes, the slight stubble on his jaw, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. The conversation that followed started about Victor Hale. News had reached them that he was being formally investigated for his wife's death, that witnesses were finally coming forward. Florence should have felt vindicated, but instead she felt haunted. "I keep thinking," she said quietly, "that could have been me. That I was days away from being in Margaret Hale's place. If you had not come, but I did come." Howard reached out and touched her arm, a gentle contact that sent electricity through her. "And you are here, safe, because of you." She looked up at him, her heart racing. "You saved me twice now, Your Grace." "Howard." His voice was rough. "When we are alone, call me Howard." Howard. The name felt intimate on her tongue. She lifted her hand, hesitated, then placed it against his chest. She could feel his heart beating fast and strong. "I do not want separate rooms anymore. I do not want this marriage to be merely an arrangement." "Florence." He said her name like a prayer. "Are you certain? I do not want you to feel obligated." "I am certain." She looked into his eyes, letting him see the truth of her words. "I choose this. I choose you. Not because of gratitude or duty, but because when I am near you, I feel more alive than I have in years." Something in his expression shifted, restraint giving way to longing. His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with exquisite tenderness. "I have wanted this since the moment I saw you at the church, looking so terrified and so brave, then stopped denying us both." Howard leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to pull away. When their lips met, it was nothing like the brief kiss at their wedding. This was heat and need and a hunger that had been building for weeks. Florence pressed closer, her hands sliding up his chest to his shoulders, feeling the solid strength of him. He deepened the kiss, his arms wrapping around her waist and pulling her against him. She could feel his heart racing against hers, the tremor in his hands as he held her. They moved through the house in a blur of kisses and whispered words, stumbling into his chambers because they were closer. Howard paused at the threshold, his breathing ragged. "Tell me again that this is what you want." "I want you," Florence said clearly. "I want this. I want us." He lifted her into his arms, carrying her to the bed with a reverence that made tears prick her eyes. Every touch was careful, worshipful, his hands trembling as he slowly unlaced her gown. She helped him with his coat, his waistcoat, until they were skin to skin, breath mingling, hearts beating in tandem. "Are you afraid?" he asked, his lips against her temple. "No." She turned her head to kiss him. "With you, I am not afraid." What followed was tender and passionate, a dance of discovery where every touch asked permission and every response granted it. Howard's hands mapped her body with gentle exploration, learning what made her sigh, what made her arch into him. Florence grew bolder, her fingers tracing the planes of his back, feeling muscles shift beneath warm skin. When they finally came together, it was with a breathless intensity that felt both overwhelming and completely right. Howard moved slowly at first, his eyes locked on hers, watching for any sign of discomfort. But there was none. Only pleasure building between them, only the rightness of two people choosing each other freely. After, they lay tangled together, Florence's head on Howard's chest, his fingers trailing through her hair. The room was warm, lit only by the dying fire in the hearth, shadows dancing across the walls. "I did not expect this," Howard said softly. "When I went to that church, I thought I was simply preventing an injustice. And now?" Florence propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. His eyes were soft, vulnerable in a way she had never seen. "Now I realize I was saving myself as much as you." He reached up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "I have been alone for so long, Florence. I forgot what it felt like to want something beyond duty." She leaned down and kissed him, slow and deep. "Then let us choose to want this, every day, not because we must, but because we can." He pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her as if she were infinitely precious. Yes, every day. They fell asleep like that, choosing each other in the quiet darkness, building something new from the ruins of what had been forced upon them. Outside, London slept, unaware that in a townhouse in Mayfair, a duke and a duchess were transforming a marriage of convenience into something that looked remarkably like love. The morning after was different. Florence woke to find herself still in Howard's bed, his arm draped across her waist, his breath warm against her shoulder. For a moment, she simply lay there, marveling at the transformation. Yesterday she had been a wife in name only. Today she was something more. Howard stirred, his eyes opening slowly. When he saw her watching him, a smile spread across his face that was entirely unguarded, almost boyish. "Good morning, Duchess." "Good morning, Duke." They shared a kiss that tasted of new beginnings, and Florence felt something shift permanently in her chest. This was not just desire or gratitude. This was the dangerous, wonderful feeling of falling in love. The days that followed bore witness to their transformation. In public, their connection was evident in small gestures. The way Howard's hand lingered at the small of her back when guiding her through doorways, how Florence would lean slightly toward him during conversations, the private smiles they exchanged across crowded ballrooms. In private, they were insatiable for each other's company. Mornings began with shared breakfast in his study, their chairs pulled close while they discussed the day's plans. Evenings ended in each other's arms, sometimes making love with tender passion, sometimes simply talking late into the night about dreams and fears and everything between. Edward noticed, of course. One afternoon he found Howard in the library, staring at nothing in particular, a foolish smile on his face. "You are in love with her," Edward observed. Howard did not bother denying it. "Completely. I am glad." Edward clapped his brother on the shoulder. "But be prepared." The investigation into Victor Hale is accelerating. The scandal will resurface, and Florence will be at the center of it. The mention of Hale's name brought darkness to Howard's expression. "What have you heard?" Edward handed him a newspaper, folded to an inside page. The article detailed new testimony from servants who had worked in Hale's household. They spoke of violence, intimidation, and the circumstances surrounding Margaret Hale's death. The tone suggested that criminal charges might be forthcoming. "Florence needs to see this," Howard said grimly. He found her in the morning room, working on correspondence for the charitable society she had become involved with. She looked up when he entered, her smile fading when she saw his expression. "What is it?" He showed her the article. Florence read it slowly, her face paling. When she finished, her hands were shaking. "That could have been me," she whispered. "If you had not come, those servants would eventually be testifying about my death." Howard knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "But I did come, and you are here, alive and safe. Nothing will change that." Florence looked at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I know. But there are other women, Howard. Women who do not have a duke to rescue them. Women being sold, traded, forced into marriages that will destroy them." She gripped his hands tighter. "We have to do something." "What did you have in mind?" Over the next weeks, Florence channeled her experience into action. She began collecting testimonies from women who had been forced into marriages through debt, coercion, or guardianship abuse. She documented their stories with careful precision. Names changed to protect them, but details preserved to illustrate the scope of the problem. Howard watched her work with growing admiration. She transformed her pain into purpose, her fear into fierce determination. She was magnificent. One evening he found her in his study, surrounded by papers, ink staining her fingers. She did not look up when he entered. "Florence, you have been working for hours. Come to bed." "Not yet." She continued writing, her hand moving rapidly across the page. "I need to finish this section about guardianship laws. If we can prove that the current system enables abuse, we can argue for reform." Howard approached and gently took the pen from her hand. "This can wait until morning. You are exhausted." She looked up at him, frustration and determination warring in her expression. "Women are suffering now, Howard. Every day we delay, another Florence Whitmore is standing at an altar next to another Victor Hale." "I know." He pulled her to her feet and wrapped his arms around her. "And we will fight for them. But you cannot help anyone if you collapse from exhaustion. We will do this together, but we will do it sustainably." Florence relaxed against him, her head on his chest. "Sometimes I feel like I am fighting the entire weight of society. You are not alone in this fight." Howard kissed the top of her head. "I have been speaking with allies in Parliament. There is support for reform, particularly after the Hale investigation brought these issues to public attention. But we need a comprehensive proposal." Florence pulled back to look at him. "What if we draft legislation together? You have the political connections, I have the stories, and the understanding of what women need. We could create something that actually makes a difference." Howard smiled. "That is exactly what I was hoping you would say." They worked side by side late into the nights, Florence writing from experience while Howard shaped her insights into legal language. The draft legislation they created was ambitious: stricter oversight of guardianship arrangements, criminal penalties for coerced marriages, and mechanisms for women to seek annulment in cases of documented abuse or intimidation. Edward joined their efforts, using his connections to identify sympathetic members of Parliament who might champion the cause. Slowly, a coalition began to form. But Victor Hale still cast a shadow over everything. News reached them that he was attempting to file charges against Howard for disrupting the wedding, and, as he claimed, kidnapping his intended bride. "Let him try," Howard said when his solicitor brought the news. "I have documentation of every debt I purchased, proof of his fraud in the marriage arrangement, and witnesses to his threats against Florence. Any court case will only expose his crimes further." Still, Florence felt the weight of Hale's malice like a physical presence. One afternoon she received an anonymous letter, brief and chilling. "You were meant to be mine. This is not over." Howard found her standing by the window, the letter trembling in her hand. He read it once, his expression going cold and dangerous. "He will never touch you. I will kill him first." Do not say such things. Florence turned to him, frightened by the violence in his voice. He is not worth destroying yourself over. Howard pulled her close, his arms tight around her. You are worth everything to me. If he threatens you, there is nothing I would not do to protect you. She felt the truth of his words in the rigid tension of his body, the fierce protectiveness that emanated from him. It should have frightened her, but instead she felt safe, cherished, loved. Then protect me by helping me finish this work, she said softly. The best revenge against Victor Hale is ensuring that men like him can never again do what he tried to do to me. Howard relaxed slightly, pressing a kiss to her forehead. You are wiser than I am. I just have different scars. That evening, they made love with an intensity born of fear and defiance, reaffirming life in the face of threats. Afterward, Florence lay in Howard's arms, tracing patterns on his chest. Tell me about the day you pulled me from the lake, she said. What were you thinking? Howard was quiet for a moment, his fingers trailing through her hair. I remember riding past and hearing the thrashing, the panic in it. I did not think, I just moved. When I got you to shore and saw your face, so pale and frightened, I wanted to stay, to make sure you were truly all right. But I was newly titled, unmarried, and you were so young. Staying would have compromised you, so you left. So I left, but I never forgot you. Over the years, I would see you at church, always with your father, always with this quiet dignity. I wanted to speak to you, but the timing never seemed right. And now I wonder how I survived all those years without you. He turned to face her, his expression serious. I love you, Florence. Not because I saved you, not out of duty, but because you are brave and brilliant and compassionate. Because when I am with you, I am better than I am alone. Florence felt tears slip down her cheeks. I love you too. I did not expect to, but I do. Completely. They held each other in the darkness. Two people who had found each other through crisis and chosen to build something beautiful from it. Outside, London continued its relentless pace, unaware that in a townhouse in Mayfair, a duke and duchess were not just falling in love, but preparing to change the world. The fight was not over. Victor Hale still lurked in the shadows, the investigation ongoing. But Florence no longer felt like a victim waiting to be rescued. She was a woman in love, with a partner beside her and a purpose driving her forward. And that made her unstoppable. The gallery of the House of Commons was filled beyond capacity on the day the marriage reform bill came to debate. Florence sat in the front row reserved for titled ladies, her hands folded tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. Around her sat other women whose stories had contributed to the legislation, women who had survived what she had nearly endured. On the floor below, members of Parliament took their seats. The atmosphere was tense, charged with the knowledge that this vote would determine whether centuries of legal precedent would bend toward justice or remain stubbornly unchanged. Howard sat in the Lord's chamber, ready to guide the bill through the upper house once it passed the Commons. They had worked for months on this moment, navigating political alliances, compromising on some points while holding firm on others, building support one conversation at a time. The debate began with a speech from Mr. Thomas Hartley, a progressive member who had become their strongest ally. His voice rang through the chamber as he outlined the abuses the current system enabled. Gentlemen, we speak often of England's greatness, of our commitment to justice and the rule of law. Yet under our current legal framework, women, our daughters and sisters, can be sold like chattel to settle debts. They can be forced into marriages with men of violence and depravity, with no recourse, no protection, no voice. He paused, letting his words settle. Then he continued, his tone growing more passionate. I have heard testimony from women who were beaten by husbands they never chose, from widows whose guardians married them to criminals, from young ladies forced to sign away their futures to save families who saw them as commodities rather than human beings. This is not civilization, gentlemen. This is barbarism, dressed in legal language. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Some members nodded in agreement. Others shifted uncomfortably. An opponent rose, Mr. Percival Blackwood, a traditionalist known for his rigid views. This bill undermines the authority of guardians and the sanctity of family arrangements. It invites government interference into private matters, and opens the door to fraudulent claims of coercion. The debate continued for hours, arguments flying back and forth. Florence listened to every word, her heart racing with each point raised and countered. She thought of Margaret Hale, whose death had finally been ruled suspicious enough to bring charges against Victor. She thought of Caroline, still trapped in her own controlled marriage. She thought of herself, standing at that altar in borrowed pearls, waiting for a life that would have destroyed her. Mr. Hartley rose again for his closing argument. He did something unprecedented. He looked directly at the gallery, at Florence and the women beside her. Some have asked who benefits from this legislation. I say, look around this chamber. Look at the gallery. There sits the Duchess of Ravensshire, a woman of intelligence and compassion who nearly became the victim of the very abuses we debate today. Had she not been rescued, literally pulled from the altar by a duke willing to risk scandal for justice, she might now be another tragic statistic. How many women do we condemn because they have no duke to save them? Florence felt every eye turn toward her. Her cheeks flushed, but she held her head high. She would not shrink from this moment. This bill, Hartley continued, gives every woman what the Duchess was fortunate enough to receive: a choice, the power to refuse coercion, the legal standing to seek protection, the recognition that a woman's life and future belong to her, not to the highest bidder or the most insistent guardian. He surveyed the chamber. Gentlemen, I ask you to vote not with your prejudices or your traditions, but with your consciences. Vote as you would if the woman in question were your own daughter. The call for the vote came. Florence stopped breathing. One by one, members stood to be counted. The tally seemed to take forever, though it could only have been minutes. Florence gripped the rail of the gallery so tightly, her knuckles turned white. The votes are counted, the speaker announced. Ayes 163, noes 141. The ayes have it. The bill passes to the House of Lords. The gallery erupted in restrained applause, women dabbing at tears, squeezing each other's hands. Florence felt a sob of relief catch in her throat. It was not over. The Lords still had to approve, but this was a victory beyond anything she had dared hope for. In the Lords' chamber, Howard received word of the Commons' vote and allowed himself a moment of fierce satisfaction. Then he went to work, calling in every favour, applying every ounce of his considerable influence. The debate in the Lords was shorter, more decorous but no less intense. When the vote came 3 days later, Florence stood once more in the gallery. This time Howard was on the floor, one of the voices arguing for passage. "Your lordships," he said, his voice carrying authority that came from both title and conviction, "I speak from personal knowledge of the evils this legislation addresses. I have seen firsthand what men of cruelty can do when law gives them unchecked power over women. I have investigated cases that would horrify you, and I have witnessed the courage of women who survived and demanded change." He paused, and Florence felt his eyes find hers across the chamber. "My wife, the Duchess of Ravensshire, was nearly destroyed by the system we are being asked to reform. She survived not through any protection the law offered, but through chance and circumstance. I ask you, is that the England we wish to defend? One where justice depends on luck rather than law?" When the Lords voted, the margin was narrower, but sufficient. The bill passed. Florence sat in the gallery as the news spread, tears streaming down her face. Around her, other women wept openly, embracing each other. Years of pain, of helplessness, of watching women be sacrificed to preserve property and honor, all of it had led to this moment. The law would not solve everything, but it would open doors, create possibilities, give women legal standing to challenge the forces that sought to control them. After the session ended, Florence met Howard in a private corridor away from the crowds. They stood looking at each other, both overwhelmed by what they had accomplished. "We did it," Florence whispered. "You did it." Howard pulled her into his arms. "You took your pain and transformed it into protection for countless women. I have never been more proud of anyone in my life." They held each other, two people who had begun as strangers thrown together by scandal and had become partners in every sense of the word. That evening, they stood together on the steps of Parliament as the sun set over London. Journalists and onlookers gathered, calling questions, but Howard ignored them all. He turned to Florence, taking both her hands in his. "Do you remember what I said to you in that church? When I burst in and claimed you as mine? Florence smiled. I remember every word. I was wrong to use that language. You were never mine to claim. You belong to yourself then, and you belong to yourself now. Howard raised her hands to his lips. What I should have said, what I say now to all of London and anyone else who cares to listen, is this. She chooses me as I choose her. Not because of duty or scandal or necessity, but because we have built something together that neither of us could have built alone. Florence felt tears slip down her cheeks, but they were tears of joy. I choose you, Howard Lancaster, every day, not because you saved me, but because you gave me the freedom to save myself. And then you stayed beside me while I did it. They kissed on the steps of Parliament, surrounded by witnesses, uncaring of scandal or propriety. Let London talk. Let society gossip. They had each other, and they had helped change the world. As they walked to their carriage, Florence looked back at the imposing building where history had been made. She thought of all the women who would benefit from the law they had fought for, all the Florence Whitmores of the future who would have legal recourse instead of only desperate hope. Sometimes freedom is not conquered with gold, she thought. Sometimes it is built with courage, with love that respects rather than possesses, with the willingness to stand together and demand change. Howard helped her into the carriage and climbed in beside her. As they drove through the streets of London toward home, he pulled her close and she rested her head on his shoulder. "What are you thinking?" he asked softly. "That the day you burst into that church and declared that I was yours, you gave me something more precious than rescue." She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "You gave me the power to declare that I am my own. And then you loved me not despite that, but because of it." Howard kissed her forehead, her cheek, her lips. "Always," he promised, "I will always choose the woman who chooses herself." The carriage carried them home through the twilight, two people who had found in each other not salvation but partnership, not possession but respect, not a cage, even one gilded with love, but wings. And as London settled into evening, in a townhouse in Mayfair, a Duke and Duchess sat together planning their next battle, their next reform, their next way of ensuring that the words, "You are safe now," would be more than a promise from a rescuer. They would be a right guaranteed by law, a choice given freely, and a love that was chosen every single day. Not because it had to be, but because it could be, and that made all the difference. Sometimes the greatest act of love is not claiming someone as yours, but giving them the freedom to claim themselves. Florence Whitmore began as a woman being sold, a commodity traded to settle debts she never owed. She could have remained a victim, trapped by circumstances beyond her control. Instead, she became an advocate, a duchess who used her position not just to save herself, but to protect countless others. And Howard, he learned that true strength is not in the rescue, but in stepping back and allowing the person you love to find their own power. Their story reminds us that the most beautiful relationships are not built on possession, but on mutual choice, renewed every day. In a world that still too often treats women as property rather than people, their fight continues to matter. What would you have done in Florence's position? Would you have had the courage to take a stranger's hand and leap into the unknown? If this story moved you, if Florence's journey resonated with something in your heart, I would be so grateful if you would leave a like on this video. It helps others find these stories of courage and transformation. And please subscribe to the channel so you never miss another tale of love, justice, and the power of choosing your own path. Finally, I would love to know, where in the world are you listening to this story? Drop a comment with your location. It amazes me how stories can cross oceans and borders to touch hearts everywhere. Thank you for sharing this journey with Florence and Howard. Until the next story, remember, you always have the power to choose yourself.